It'll still record your video, even though I can't see it. That's the crazy thing about this thing. I'll cut this part out. Don't worry.
Okay, no worries.
All right. Yeah, your video will come back in a sec. So I wanted to pick up where we were headed, I think, in the last time we talked, and talk a little bit about, how NIL is trickling down to high school sports and what that landscape is like for high school student athletes, and where it's headed.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because a lot of pushback on NIL at the college level was largely because people felt like it was the end of amateurism, and in many respects it is, right? Like you have a lot of traditional purists of sports who really valued the idea that college athletes weren't getting paid. So just as we start to address that and people start getting used to it and understanding NIL's role in college sports, then it starts to happen at the high school level. And again, just the separation between NIL is really an individual law that allows you as an individual to monetize your name, image, and likeness. And then all the kind of federations that regulate sport have had to fall in line to allow a student athlete, regardless of age, regardless of school level, to be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. So then what ends up happening is you got high school athletes, and you got high school athletes who are now saying, look, I've got 500,000 Instagram followers and I've got 1 million followers on TikTok. I should be able to do the same. So what's happened is states have regulated and put laws in place that allow high school athletes to also take advantage of NIL. And that's happened in about, I think, it's probably 20 to 21 states, somewhere around there. Georgia, they just passed a law as well in the last couple of weeks. Virginia's passed the law. And now you have high school athletes that can take advantage of it. The reality is most high school athletes, in terms of their marketability and market value, there really isn't any. These are 16, 17-year-old kids. Now, if you're a star quarterback, a star basketball player, star baseball player, you may have a greater advantage because while I don't have proof that this is happening, but you may have collectives or you may have businesses that are owned by alumni of schools that will go to that high school athlete and do an NIL deal with them in hopes that it may positively influence them to go to a specific school. And that's the dirty side of NIL, but in reality, that's probably where the majority of opportunities or maybe the majority of money at the high school level is going. The second part of that is you do have some national brands, and I can't talk about one specifically, but I do know that part of their strategy is to enter into agreements with high school athletes, not to market them, but to pay them money to help support their training costs, all that sort of stuff, get some marketing out of it, but very subtle, but in hopes that if they continue their career trajectory and turn pro at some level, that they'll have a relationship with that specific brand. That I do know is going on with national brands. And it's not I think it's kind of a interesting strategy. And I think they write it off as, hey, we're doing the right thing by not over promoting a 16 or 17-year-old kid. At the same time, you also have parents that are certainly taking advantage of NIL at the high school level. And these are, this isn't happening everywhere, so I don't want to, crap on parents per se, but there are parents that see that their kid is successful at the high school level, has an opportunity to play at the highest level in college, and they themselves are marketing their kids for NIL deals. Mm-hmm. It's got in reality, it's, again, the dirty side of NIL, and it's really become a recruiting tool rather than a true marketing platform.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, like thinking of it in terms of a long-term investment that, certain brands would make. It's a huge risk, but I guess, they're not risking a whole lot of money in the grand scheme of things. But
They
yeah.
aren't, and it's not unlike IMG, which you're probably familiar with. IMG is one of the
Mhm.
greatest sports management agencies in history, and they would make significant investments in talent at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Typically tennis players, and they would
Mhm.
discover these kids, and they would take them under their wing, and they would fund their life, or basically their travel and their housing to come and train under Nick Bollettieri, and in hopes that when they got to 18 years old, that they would own their rights and they'd manage them and they'd make all their money back in career earnings.
Mhm.
I would say that they probably worked out for them because of representing Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras and the
Mhm.
Williams sisters at one point. And so I think that those types of things actually did work out for them.
Yeah, you have to invest money into it to find the diamond in the rough, right?
You do. There's
So.
no doubt about it. And we've talked about this is that it's you are rolling the dice because no one ever knows when an athlete is either going to peak or lose interest or get injured. And so those investments matter. I think in terms of NIL from the very purest level, if people believe that a high school athlete or even a college athlete they're aligned in value with a brand. They embody what the brand messaging is. If they believe in the kid and they invest money in them to market the brand on their social platforms, one would argue that it's probably money well spent. There is a
Mhm.
lot of research out there that says that influencers have heavy engagement amongst their audience. And so it's a cheap investment from a marketing standpoint. When you look at athletes, their engagement level is almost twice that of a traditional influencer. So one could argue that student athletes are the greatest influencers of all time as it relates to social media. If that's the case, and if there's a brand that really does their research and they find a student athlete and they engage in a relationship, there's probably very good benefits to entering into an NIL relationship, regardless of the age.
So what's kind of the threshold that, and I imagine it varies by brand, but you know, what type of followership is a brand looking for to, say that, okay, this person's an influencer,
Yeah.
what determines that level?
So it's really funny. I don't know, and I think it largely depends on the brand. So, we just
Right.
had a national brand in the yogurt space came to us this past week, and they are looking for very specific college athletes that have a minimum of 100,000 followers on Instagram and a 500,000 followers on TikTok. And when we started looking at it, I mean, if you said we need 1,000, sorry, there's a bird here, so I apologize if you hear that. Uh, so if you said 1,000 followers on Instagram, that net is wide. But when
Yeah.
you go to 500,000, I mean, that is a small amount. And then you carve it down to specific sports or specific genders, and
Mhm.
all of a sudden it becomes minuscule. We went back to them and we asked them why. And they said, one is we're more concerned, less concerned about engagement. We're more concerned about casting a wide net. We want a lot of people to see our name, understand our
Mhm.
brand, and what we're doing. Then you
Right.
have other brands that we work with that really are looking for heavy engagement, and they want student athletes that people really tune in, they engage, they watch their videos, and they spend time on the marketing message. So it really depends, and I don't know what the right answer is, other than from a marketing standpoint, we see greater success when um, when brands partner with student athletes with heavy engagement. They see more
Mhm.
success. They see more return on investment than when they try to cast a wide net. So I think it really depends. I will tell you that there's very few brands that want to deal with a student athlete who has less than 1,000 Instagram followers. And this herein lies kind of the biggest issue. My child, who I think she has 2,500, or sorry, it's like 3,000 Instagram followers. I'd probably get in trouble
She's
for
going to be
saying
mad at you if you get it wrong.
it's exactly right. So I want to make sure I'm right.
Right.
I have trouble in saying to her, look, you need to grow your Instagram followers, for fear of, one, how does she grow them? And
Right.
then two, versus me as a dad saying, you need to stop spending so much time on social. Right. And so there's been a little bit of kind of discussion back and forth on her monetizing herself. And I think what her perception is, look, if a brand doesn't want to deal with me because they believe that, I'm not pushing my social following big enough, then that's probably a brand I don't want to work with. But if a brand looks at me and believes that, hey, I represent what their mission and message, and I can help convey that, then that's probably a brand I want to speak with. And, one of the brands in particular, which is an athletic apparel brand, the relationship has been fantastic. She's done a really good job. They value her, and it's been a good relationship.
So how are these kids growing their following and engaging? Like, what do brands see as being valuable engagement? You can just get on there and spew whatever, or you can like bring value to your following. How are kids doing it, and then how are brands evaluating that?
Yeah, so Scott, I think I think that one is the old trick of buying followers does not work anymore, because you have systems in place now that can actually weed that out and see if you bought followers. So a year ago, 2 years ago, people were buying tens of thousands of followers. That doesn't it happens, but brands are too smart for that now. Right. So it's really organic. And so there are data scientists and people that truly understand social. It's a lot. If again, using my daughter for an example, she would probably have to spend an hour or more a day to be able to grow her following organically. And that means reaching into communities of like-minded followers, commenting on posts of those people, hoping to get their followers to then look at her post and follow her. There's a lot of kind of science and methodology behind it. I think it's partly that. I think they're also social by nature, right? These kids are connecting with others, friends are following friends. And so the growth rate of these kids is not growing. They're not growing as fast as they used to, because there's a lot more people there, but it also takes a lot more. The other side is, if you're a star athlete, you're in the top 5% of your sport, you're getting media exposure and people are following you. And so that's why there's no, arguing that the top quarterbacks or the top basketball players have huge followings, because people just are. Or if you're a gregarious personality, like you look at the LSU women's basketball team, their starting lineup, these are all exceptional young ladies, very marketable. And when they won, they were in the media and people started following. So they've got huge followings right now. So that's one. Now, in terms of engagement levels, so it's a great question. There's a bunch of different tools that brands use, and certainly the influencer agencies that we work with use to measure engagement. And so it's not simply just liking or hearting a post. It's really looking at the post. If it's a video, watching the video, sharing the video, commenting on the video, those types of things, or even the image as well. Those things are really showing engagement. And once you start to develop a kind of a pattern of high engagement, brands start looking and go, okay, their content is interesting. It's not provocative. Some cases it's provocative, but most of the time it's interesting and it's appealing to an audience. And there's some college athletes that they've mastered it. They're creative, they're smart, they're funny, and they just know how to relate, but they spend a lot of time doing
it. Yeah. I've started using Instagram to promote this podcast, and it's so difficult to grow a following. And I'm putting clips of what I think are interesting podcasts out there. And, you know, it's some days it's crickets. So, maybe I'm just not that interesting. um,
Well, maybe,
yeah.
but no, no,
And then,
Scott. I've learned through our employee base, and we have a number of young people that work for us that are socially native and social media natives, and they understand the science. I have a
mhm,
fond appreciation for our social media managers because
mhm,
it does take work, and I'll also say, like, I'm kind of I'm Instagram or I'm TikTok or I'm
mhm,
YouTube. And these kids don't think individually, they think of it all as one. So what they're seeing on YouTube typically is on TikTok and it's typically on Instagram. So they're capturing eyeballs on every platform except for Facebook, right? They're too young for Facebook, but they're capturing this and they're driving people between platforms and they're building audiences that all are starting to combine. It's really impressive.
I need to bring one of them on to help me out, obviously.
It's
um,
hard
yeah,
for us
you
old guys.
mentioned, what's that?
Yeah, it's hard for us old people to take advice from young people.
Yeah, I would gladly take it on this one. Yeah. So you mentioned an influencer agency. Are they connecting influencers who are athletes with NIL opportunities?
They are, yeah.
Hmm.
So one of the first things when NIL started, one of the first things that happened were they were platforms. One called Influencer, Open Doors,
Hmm.
Icon Source. These are platforms that essentially match brands with influencers based on a lot of different criteria. So schools were immediately adopting those marketplaces because it was a way to quickly get your athletes in a controlled environment, meeting with brands. And so they still had a lens on what was going on to ensure that there was compliance. And, if you were a Nike school and your star quarterback wasn't signing a deal with a competitor and promoting, so these marketplaces opened up and they've done a really good job um, getting the brands in. And so what they'll do is they'll come in, they'll register, the student athletes come in and they register, and then the brands search and they find exactly the kind of the athletes that they want, and
Hmm.
then they connect them. The challenge has been that student athletes are busy. And
Yeah.
so between class, between sports, what little social life they have, that when a brand reaches out and says, "Hey Scott, I'd like to do an NIL deal with you. I'm going to pay you $40 a post to do 10 posts for me." A student athlete looks at it and goes, "Okay, that's going to be 3 hours of my time, $400. Is it really worth it?" And
Right.
so, you it always hasn't materialized. I think you've seen a number of the platforms go away, and you've seen a couple that have really hung in there. Influencer being one. Open Doors is the biggest by far,
Hmm.
and it does a good job. Um, and so ultimately, again, it goes back to you know a brand can be out there, they can open up the door, they can look for the student athlete, but if the student athlete isn't motivated and isn't going to do the work, then it's never going to work.
Right. Right. So if you take away, the top percent of the revenue generating sports, and I can't remember if we talked about this last time, but we'll just reiterate it nonetheless. So if you take away football, you take away basketball, you take away really the TV sports, I guess, and you're just, like your daughter, a soccer player, my son, a soccer player, or a women's lacrosse player, or something like that. So they can engage with these agencies, and not that the other sports can't, but um, and that's like right now, that's the best way to maximize the opportunity of NIL. Or are you finding or seeing that people who kind of strike out on their own and try to manage it themselves are doing better than that?
Yeah. So I think it's one and the same, Scott. I think that the most successful outside of your top athletes, your top 1% that are getting inbound, those that are really growing and building and creating NIL deals are those that are approaching it as a business, being aggressive, and doing all the outreach on their own, whether it's at a marketplace or it is directly to a brand. So there's a football player at Norfolk State. He might have graduated, but he was the king of NIL. You can research him, and he was reaching out, and he had hundreds of brand deals, hundreds. And everybody's like, how is this guy doing it, right? Norfolk State's a small school, and he's not a household name, but he was a hustler, and he was going in. And some of these deals might have been $250. Some of them might have been 5,000, but he was going out and hustling. And when he got a deal, I mean, he overworked it, and he did more for the brand than the brand ever expected. And so word got out, and he became the king of NIL. Those types of individuals, I think, are few and far between. He's just inherently, he's a business guy and a hustler.
Right.
A lot of kids aren't like that. And so, but I think to answer your point, I think it's a roadmap. With my daughter, we sat down and we created a media kit for her. Now, when I say a media kit, it sounds like a lot. It was a one-pager back and front. Front was who she is, what she's into, her likes and interests, because what we know is if a kid likes or has a passion about something, they're going to market a product that's in that category a heck of a lot better than in a category that they don't like or don't have passion for. So we created a profile of everything that she likes, what she's passionate about. And on the back side, we created an overview of like schooling, her growth path, her career stats, what she was doing, and then kind of some ideas that she would like to do for the brand that she could fill in. And then we created lists within those categories. So she was passionate about athletic apparel, nutrition, cosmetics, and I'm probably escaping one or two. I think it was nursing because she's wants to be a nurse. And so then we went out and found, I made her research and create a list of brands, and then we sent these out. And it was interesting because we got a couple people that followed up, and she got small brand deals, mostly product. And then I said, okay, Delaney, now it's time to pick up the phone and start calling these brands and following up on the communication you sent. And she's looked at me like I had four heads. She's like, oh, no, that's not part of the deal. But I think in theory, that is what you have to do. And I'll tell you, as far as going to the University of Miami, living in Miami, Miami's expensive. And so I even had her reach out to the apartment community that she lives in. She lives with two other players. They live in a beautiful apartment community. The CEO was the company is actually based in Dallas. And I had her put a letter together and reach out directly to the CEO. The CEO passed it off, but they declined. But, she was learning in that process that, the worst thing that anybody can say is no.
Right.
So, but I think at the end of the day, Scott, for outside that 1%, if you really want to maximize your name, image, and likeness, because it is yours, you have to put in the work, and you have to be creative, and you have to stand out. And you is going through that process, you learn. And the other thing too is we own the NIL Summit, as I mentioned, and the NIL Summit is an amazing event where we recognize hundreds of student athletes every year for their work in NIL. And it's fascinating because when they get up and they talk, when they receive an award and they get up and they talk about their vision or the effort that they put in, the vast majority of them will tell you, I worked harder on achieving NIL deals than I actually did on the field or in practice. And because oftentimes sports is natural to these kids, where taking them out and actually putting them into a business environment where they have to actually sell themselves and they have to listen to a brand's needs and they have to be creative around a solution, that was difficult for them.
Right.
But all of these kids, it's fascinating just to be around them and listen to the way they're talking to one another in terms of their creativity and what they're
Yep.
trying to do to differentiate themselves to get money.
Right. Well, it's important because it gets them out of their comfort zone where,
Totally.
things are kind of given to them, to a certain extent as an athlete, and to have to go out and represent themselves and, talk about their own value is
Yeah,
super important in the real world. Right.
it
Um,
is.
yeah.
In sports, it's all about that, right? Sports is all about pushing a kid outside his comfort zone because once
Hmm.
you do, they build confidence, they learn how to navigate, and it ultimately makes them better. And so,
Right.
and in school, I think it's kind of the same way. It's, you got to be pushed outside and it's got to be difficult. And I think this
Right.
is just a natural extension of it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Talk about your NIL Summit. What is that all about?
Yeah. So we're entering our third year of it. And so
Hmm.
this was a brainchild of Jason Belzer, who's the founder of Student Athlete NIL. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to have a single event every year that did three things. One, it honored student athletes for their achievements in NIL. In other words, marketing themselves. Number two is he wanted to bring uh, all of the stakeholders together in one location. So student athletes, college administrators, media, and brands. And then third is he wanted to create an educational summit where, with all these people together, you'd be able to discuss, talk, collaborate, educate, especially in an industry that's changing consistently. So it
Hmm.
takes place every June. It's over a 3-day period. It's at the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta. We shut down the Hall of Fame. We last year we started off the night. Everybody arrived. There was a red carpet event where the kids lined up. You have celebrities that come in and actually speak and give awards, and then we have an awards dinner. And Flage, who's the All American, I think she was freshman of the year at LSU basketball player, who's also an aspiring rapper, actually performed at the after party, and just an amazing event. And then it's filled with 2 more days of educational summits, and we have brands like Invesco, QQQ, Kia, Meta, Instagram, Influencer, who are all part of it as well. And they're part of the education part of it. So Invesco QQQ did a whole symposium on financial management and what people should be doing and how they should be doing it.
Hmm.
Instagram and Meta were doing all about social marketing and how to utilize tools that help you to grow. Intuit was all about taxes, how to manage your taxes, because there's all these kids are experiencing tax
Right.
consequences. And then one of the coolest things, actually, it was all cool, but one of the coolest things was Lululemon did its first ever NIL sponsorship at the summit, and it hosted and had the largest NIL activation out of any brand in history. And
Huh.
they did a yoga event for all the student athletes in Olympic Centennial Park, right, which sits in the heart of Atlanta. As the sun
Hmm.
was rising, you had over 100 student athletes doing yoga out in Centennial Olympic Park. So it's really amazing. And I got to tell you, from a guy who uh, has been in the work world and works with athletes and has been in the sports industry, I was really inspired by the stories, by the vision, the way these kids were talking. And I say kids, these adults, they were talking about their business and the opportunities around NIL. Um, and I'll say one thing. One other thing was one of the student athletes who is a star football player at University of Florida probably has a chance to go pro. But he told me that besides the money, he said the money was kind of secondary in NIL. He said the thing that he has gotten the most value is that NIL has seemed to open up a conversation with people in industries that he is really excited about. And he happens to want to go the route of artificial intelligence, software development, those types of things. He said that NIL has helped him to connect with Florida alumni who are experts in those fields and are giving him opportunities to start getting involved in those businesses at an early age. And I think that at the end of the day may be the greatest benefit of NIL.
Yeah, it just creates a huge networking opportunity.
For sure.
It's like a job interview every day, really, when you're out there, showing who you are, right?
That's right.
I mean,
you
it's
think about it,
fantastic.
Scott, it's like anything in sales, right? If you went out and you wanted to sell software and you went to 10 different people and you sold your software, you may get 10 no's. But the hope is that you may get 10 new business relationships of people that say, "Hey, I didn't need Scott's software, but man, I like Scott." And I think the same thing goes with NIL. It's pushing these kids into an area where they're a little bit uncomfortable, but they're meeting people that potentially could have impact on their careers, on their life, beyond sport.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think this will probably help some people who are skeptical about NIL. I think, it really makes sense. It's part of their education as well. If you're not just chasing dollars and you're really trying to develop yourself, beyond college. So yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
That is the key, Scott. Is I look at my own kid, and she just announced the other day that she's hanging up her cleats and wrapping her career, and which we talked about was emotional. I still was holding on hope that she'd exercise her COVID year, but she said that she's gotten everything out of the sport that she ever wanted to, and she came out healthy.
right.
And so as I look at that, I also look back and say, man, she's created some great relationships because of NIL. And whether she uses them or not, she's really benefited from the whole experience. And I hope that every kid, again, my mission with NIL and with what we do at SNIL, or Student Athlete NIL, is I want every student athlete, regardless of sport, regardless if they play, regardless of their role on the team, that everybody gets to experience it in one way, shape, or form. So, if that's all it does, then NIL has been a beautiful thing for these individuals.
Right. What's been the trend in colleges? Are they embracing NIL? Or is it a mixed bag? And how are they allocating assets to help kids with pursuing? Aside from what you do with collectives, are the universities actually like engaging in all this?
So it's a great question. It really depends, Scott. It depends on the university president. It depends on the athletic director, and it depends on the head of their foundation. And the reason being is that you definitely have schools where the athletic director and the president are not interested in pursuing NIL because there are some risks, right? As soon as a college gets involved in NIL in terms of how money is administered, you start to run into Title IX issues. So no school, no athletic department wants anything to do with that. So there's largely been this kind of arm's length. In terms of the foundation, however, the foundation has been leveraged to be able to redirect money to student athletes who then perform charitable services on behalf of the foundation. So money from donors going into the foundation is a tax-free donation, and then that money going back out to student athletes to support the student athletes NIL, but they actually do services for them. Ultimately, the solution is going to be where the school and the student athletes need to work together, whether that is student athletes becoming employees of the university and NIL being flowed through the university and they're paying for these student athletes, which has big challenges around labor and those types of regulations. The other is revenue share, like revenue that comes into the athletic department and that's shared with student athletes. Like how does all that work? But ultimately, the solution will be that the schools will have to be involved in NIL in some way, shape, or form. I
Right.
think all of that's being ironed out right now, whether
Yeah.
it's from a legislation standpoint. Um, you know, there. I think you've got a lot of people that believe that it has to be administered through the schools. But then you start to get the complexity of Title IX. You get this complexity between a public school and a private school, and you get one that has huge donor base and huge donor
Mhm.
dollars, and so does there become salary cap? So it's a long-winded answer to say, you know, it really depends. I think most athletic directors that have 5 years left before they retire would love not to deal with NIL at all. I think it has created such a complexity for them that they'd prefer not to deal with it.
Yeah.
But right now, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of noise in the industry around schools that are not doing the right thing with NIL. You know, it's there's perception that money's coming in, going and paying athletes for performance, and and I can't argue that yes, that's happening or no, that it's not. But the reality is, if a donor comes in and puts $1 million one year, and then the next year the team, goes 3-7, and that donor says, "Oh, I'm not going to do it anymore." There's probably a perception that he put money in or she put money in for performance. Um,
Right.
so those things need to be resolved. My guess is that we'll start to see some sort of more structure around school donor base, brands, fan base, and student athletes
Mhm.
in the next 2 to 3 years.
Right. Um, so, all right, if you were advising a kid who is getting recruited, a junior or senior in high school, um, how do you advise them to evaluate what the NIL situation is at a school, and how do they determine how important it is to them? How do they educate themselves on it to find the best situation for themselves? Just how do they evaluate what's there, and what it can offer them, and
Yeah,
the opportunities that it could create um, on an individual level.
yeah, for sure. So, the first thing I always tell a kid when they're looking at colleges is select a college not on sports, not on girls or boys or the coaches or the program. Select a school because that's a place you'd go for 4 years, regardless of anything else. We all know that kids get injured, kids fall out of love with the sport. So make
Hmm.
sure that you're in a place that makes you incredibly happy. Secondarily is when you go in outside of the coaching staff and outside of everything, if you're looking at NIL, the first question to ask is when you're talking to the coaches, please tell me about the NIL program and the services that the school provides me in order to maximize my name, image, and likeness. And so the coach may say, well, the athletic department has an educational program, which most of them do now, and they educate student athletes on not only the compliance, but also, too, how to maximize your name, image, and likeness. Secondarily, is they may have a collective or a group of collectives that are supporting the athletes or the athletic teams of the university. So we met with um, a athletic collective yesterday at one of the top um, universities in the Atlantic Coast Conference yesterday, and we were talking to them because this specific collective only works with football, and they have one that works with men's basketball, they have one that works with women's basketball, they have one that works with baseball, and so not an ideal situation, but for a student athlete coming in, they may find that there is a collective that specifically works with their team. And if they do, the question then would
Oh,
be
wow.
is, are there funds available to for me to leverage my name, image, and likeness? Or can you talk to me about how you bring brands in to create opportunities for me to be able to use my name, image, and likeness? Now, I say all that because I think that's the right approach for any student athlete. The flip side is the expectation, however, needs to be managed because just like we were talking about earlier, if the student athlete has not built a social following, then really what are they marketing? Two, if the student athlete isn't willing to work to get the a deal or be able to work to do what there's needed of them to market, then the opportunity for them is probably not there. So it's a two-way street. Now, if you're a star wide receiver and you're walking in, the chances are the collective is going to be involved in those discussions and really help to say, hey, look, we believe you're marketable enough that we have 5 brands that are willing to step in. If you come to the school, they see value in you and they want to be a part of your time here and want to work with you from a marketing perspective.
Gotcha. So let's close out with the differences between the different divisions. Obviously, D1 will get a lot of attention, but let's say you're at a D3 school in a small town. Are you seeing opportunities being created there in those situations?